So fitting the shutter drive, we have our top built minus the lid. Our first operation is to fit the brackets that guide the chain. Now on a 2.2 metre dome like this one, we have 3 chain guide brackets spaced at 430 mil. On a 2.7, you'll have 4 brackets spaced at 410 mil. We take our measurements from the very top of the aperture, bring the tape over, and we mark at 430 each point. We then take our bracket, loop it over the top, and then drill our hole as a guide. Obviously this dome is pre-drilled because we're using it in the workshop. So fitting our chain guide, it's the same on all domes. We've got our pre-drilled hole. We're going to get our bolt, put it through, take our spacer, feed it in, and then get our nut on the end, and we're just going to tighten them up. Once it's tight, we move on to the next bracket. Okay, when fitting our brackets, if the bracket is tight over the threshold, line it up as best you can with the hole and just run a file in that area just to narrow that gap slightly so that it sits comfortably over, and then bolt through as we've previously done. With all 3 of our brackets fitted, we're ready to fit the final chain guide. We've already looked at moulding marks on the instructional video earlier, but we have our holes drilled on the moulding marks to correspond, and we just put our nuts and bolts through, a nut on the back, and then just ensure that the bracket is straight. So as you look down the chain guides, you can see that the bracket isn't kicking off to a particular angle, and then just tighten the bolts and we're ready to go. It's worth mentioning on this dome we already have our weather strip fitted, but it's a job you can do before or after fitting the chain guides. Just check that's straight. Okay, we're now fitting the chain. The chain comes pretty much pre-cut to length of your dome. It comes set for a 2.2 with an extension piece for a 2.7 that runs on a master link that we'll come to in a minute. But we're just threading the chain over the top of the guides, round the back guide, and then through the middle of the bracket. On all the brackets, then we can join the chain. Okay, we've got our chain linked. We're now ready to fit the shutter drive. It's quite simple really. We just loop the chain around the central pulley on the drive, making sure it's tight. Hold the drive in place and then just double check with line of sight to make sure you've got a nice clean line and the chain isn't contacting hard against any of the brackets. Once we're happy with the position, and you can use a clamp so that you can get a good line of sight, we're going to drill 2 8mm holes at the top and put our bolts through. Now it's worth bearing in mind that the shutter drive, unless you've powered it up before, the shutter drive will appear dead because it's in a shipping mode, so you need to apply a power supply to wake it up before you can test operation. Once we have our bolts in place, we can make sure the drive is sitting straight and square and tighten them up using an Allen bolt and a 13mm spanner. Okay, once we have the shutter drive fitted and bolted in place, it's time to fit our limit switch. Very simple, there's no direct measurement, but we want it clear of the shutter drive towards the middle of the panel. Just measure from the edge to your desired point. Hold the limit switch up so it's flush with the top, and using the 2 holes in the limit switch as a guide, just drill through and put your bolts. And then that measurement is repeated on the top so that they are exactly aligned for the actuator on the lid, which we'll come to shortly. Okay, we fitted our chain, our shutter drive and our limit switch. It's time to wire the limit switches in. Very simple, 2 terminals match the back of the switch. There's no polarity to this. And all we're going to do is feed each cable behind the brackets just to keep the cable out of the way for a little bit of rudimentary cable management. Once we've fed the cable through, we can plug them in at the bottom of the shutter drive, and again, it doesn't matter which socket, it will work its way out. It's worth noting that the shutter drive will not function until the limit switches and motor are connected, and it's been connected to a power source to take it out of shipping mode. Okay, once connected, we're just going to want to take the cable out the way. Now we've fitted our limit switches, cabling, shutter drive, we're ready to put the lid on. Essentially, it's quite simple, can be done with 1 person, but 2 is much easier. We locate the shutter rollers in one side, and then we bend the lid over and just pop it in. It may feel tight, but there is enough flex. It won't break. And then our lid's on. At this point, we can now line up for the actuator bracket for the shutter limit switches. Now obviously ours is pre-drilled because we fitted it before. So just pretend we haven't got a hole in. But all we need to do is bring the shutter down, make a mark where the center of the switch is, and then measure 50mm up and drill an 8mm hole. The same for the chain guide. Make a mark where the chain meets, 50mm up and drill a 6mm hole. We can then bolt the bracket for the actuator, and we can attach the chain to the shutter lid. Okay, we're going to fit our shutter limit switch actuator. Hook side always goes down because this is also used for a shutter pulley on a manual dome as a security stay. So it's going to put our nut and bolt through and bolt the bracket on using our 8mm bolt, making sure that the bracket is sitting largely square. Okay, we're attaching the chain to the shutter lid. Just roll it down, put our bolt through, put our washer, and then tighten our M6 nut. Now we have everything set, it's tempting to test the shutter drive, and that's fine. We can press the button, etc., but we do need to make sure we don't let it run all the way to the back, as the shutter lid will ground out on the floor and potentially cause damage. So do test. As we can see, everything's running nice and smoothly. But don't be tempted to go too far back.